Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we're going to be tackling a guide to vengeance for PvP. First things I want to say here is that if you're interested in defensives and just the rotation for defenses and how you should use them, I have a dedicated guide to that. I'll show that on screen and the link to that will be in the description. So if you are interested in mainly defenses, feel free to check that out. And also if you're looking for gearing advice and what the critical DR for your class is and or how to reach those min-max stats without wasting too much credits, if at all any credits, feel free to check out that video. That'll also be in the description. Other than that, we'll be going over all that stuff anyway. So if you're just interested in vengeance, this is a perfect video for you. To give you a quick overview of Vengeance, it is pretty similar to Rage for the most part. If you haven't seen my previous video covering Rage Juggernaut, for the most part, it is the easiest melee, I would say, without a doubt. So when it comes to easiest classes probably to play, you're looking at Madness for range and Vengeance for melee. It is a cleave spec. It's single target. Definitely isn't as good as it used to be, but it still has decent single target control, and it's not terrible overall for single target. It's just not anywhere near as strong as it used to be, much less comparable to other single target classes in the game. However, it does have good control, so there's that. If you're interested in cleave, the main thing that we're doing since 6.0 on Vengeance is that you can slam, and you can slam a lot, especially if people are cleaving or they're stacked up, you can cleave them to death. It is probably one of the most deadly cleave situations in the entire game. If you ever get that lined up, you get all three of your dots going and you pop Enrage and start slamming, people are going to be dying fast. You're going to get your Enrage back constantly. It is a cleave monster, and I can even show you guys a clip on screen. It is quite devastating. So first thing I'm going to do is go over gearing. When it comes to hitting your stat pools, 4200 is the critical DR. If I had the 2 extra mastery augs, I would definitely drop my critical for the mastery. That put me about 18.5 mastery. That's when you want to stop putting points into mastery if you have something better to put your stats into. However, at this point, I wouldn't have anything better to put those points into, so it wouldn't make much sense. However, if you're ever min-maxing yourself, there is a point where mastery kind of hits a DR, and if you do not have proper stats, like proper critical or proper alacrity, it is time to look at fixing those stats before pushing further into mastery, as you won't see much benefit. The same thing kind of goes for critical. Once you've hit your DR for critical, most of the time mastery is going to pull ahead for you. There are some specific cases where you might want to have slightly more critical, so you can get your critical hit chance up on specific abilities. So for example, shocks, crit rate on lightning is not very good, so it is a case of having higher alacrity to help with that issue. Regardless, most of your abilities don't really have an issue, as you get a lot of blanket critical hit chance for free on the spec. Regardless, this is what I run. I don't really swap this up. High alacrity is very viable on this spec, and you would be dropping your power relic for the critical one in order to make that work. And then you would also be looking at 5,431 alacrity or above. If you're interested in high alacrity in general, definitely recommend checking out my gearing guide, as it will show you how to hit that and then maximize your crit without losing too much stats overall. Regardless, getting into our implants, so we don't really swap these out. This is the standard damage increase option. However, you would be dropping your Fearless of Victor for Second Wind in most matches, and on top of that, you could potentially even run Nimble Master as well, especially in 4 arenas where you have to run and you have to kite and you have to rely on that. However, it's not always going to be the use case. For the most part, Champion's Precision always on Second Wind will be another very good one. It synergizes with your Endure Pain, so do keep that in mind. It also synergizes with your Enrage Heal, which you won't be able to see right now, but when I go into talents, you'll be able to see it later. And then obviously Slam Spam is the tactical that will pretty much always take. Hemophilic Slash is also not terrible, however it's more of a PvE parse thing. you're not really getting too much damage out of this overall. However, if you do take a certain build, this can do decent damage, but overall it is very counterable and not as enjoyable for PvP. I don't recommend it, and for the most part, even on single target and in situations where you're barely getting cleave, cut to pieces usually outperforms. Now when it comes to defensive tacticals, we really only have Grit Teeth. There's not much reason to run anything else. However, there are some tacticals out there that wouldn't be completely trolling for using, but for the most part, Grit Teeth is like the only one worth it. There's like Biorhythm, which I've talked about in the previous video where I was talking about how to put it. Its interaction with healing and percent healing, it does work. So there is a lot of healing potential on this spec, but you have to think losing your cut to pieces is just not worth it. So do keep that in mind. And then you have Life Warden. This is just a basic thing. Like, most of the time I wouldn't recommend this unless you absolutely are not getting any cleave. And usually only for arenas. Now with that out of the way, obviously Nebel Master would be the other one, which I don't have. But don't forget that one. Other than that, that's pretty much it for gearing. It's pretty static. It's pretty simple. Not much changes here. If you guys have any questions about it, feel free to ask. I'd be more than happy to cover anything that I missed. However, moving into, let's say, priority. All right. And by priority, we meant defensives, not offensives just yet. We'll go over that next. When it comes to your defensives, the main thing to know is that Endure Pain is different on Vengeance specifically. You get a passive 5% damage reduction, just baseline. This is this talent, but you also get an additional 15% damage reduction while Endure Pain is active. Endure Pain increases your percent health, so this means Blood Rage percent health healing is more valuable, and the reasons to run Second Wind are basically made more valuable as well. So any situation where you can get a kill or you're about to secure a kill contribution, popping Endure Pain before that can make Endure Pain an actual usable defensive that isn't going to cost you health. It's not going to be a net negative, if that makes sense. There's a double-edged sword kind of defensive, so it is definitely more nuanced and takes more time to truly get value out of, if that makes sense. So when it comes to mastering defensives, Endure Pain is going to be one of the harder ones for you to get down. However, the other ones are relatively simple. There's not much to think about here. So for example, when it comes to Leap, this blue aura around you is the 4 seconds of damage reduction and CC immunity. When that falls off, you are no longer immune. So for example, when you leap, say you do an ability and we force push and then we leap again, obviously you can immediately leap. You wouldn't have to do what I just did. That would leave no gaps of 8 seconds of CC immunity and damage reduction. That's really good. And if you're running a Reflect, which I do recommend for most players that are not experienced and they're not very good at movement, highly recommend running a Reflect because Reflect will deny the damage that you'll take from reflectable abilities. So that means you're saving yourself from taking damage. And this is a great denial tool. So for example, if you do your double leap, you got a lot of damage reduction, and then you pop your Reflect. People are probably going to CC you as the immunity is going to fall off, so you're going to have a Reflect for that. That's really going to help you survive and deal with things. And then when it comes to your next defenses, since you don't really have much damage reduction outside of popping Endure, out of popping Endure Pain or Leap, you're looking at probably tying your Warzone in general with your Enraged Defense. Anytime that you can get away without having to pop both of those at the same time is very powerful. There's some situations where you can pop Saber Ward, Enraged Defense, but overall I don't recommend it, mostly just because overlapping defensives is just not a good thing, especially for a class that is not very durable and has access to getting healing through doing damage. So one ideal here is that you would pop Warzone in general just to make sure that you don't die through your Enraged Defense, if that makes sense. And if there is any situation where you're not going to die through your Enraged Defense, then you can hold on to your Adrenal a little bit longer, and then once you're at full health, pop your Adrenal to make sure that you have damage reduction rolling, you have something going. And outside of that, you usually want to use your Saber Ward last, as sometimes it's the least useful, but it is not a terrible defensive overall. In matchups where your Saber Ward is more useful, like Arsenal, Marksman, Carnage against those specs, it is better to use your saber ward before your general, as it will be much more counter potential, if that makes sense. You'll be able to deal with their burst a lot better. There's even a chance to say that maybe you pop your enraged defense before like anything else, and then pop your saber ward a little bit later, just like hold on to it as long as you can, as it'll be such a good stop to their damage. Now, regardless of the situation, enraged defense is usually the second defensive that you're going to be looking at popping overall when it comes to like playing, whether you have mad dash or reflect. So let's say you don't have reflect, you have mad dash, you're most likely going to use mad dash first. That's usually always going to be your number one. So for example, mad dash is only 35 seconds. The whole ideal is to cycle through your lowest cooldowns first. Endure Pain, there's definitely a use where you can get Endure Pain off early as like your first or second defensive. However, just do know that you're going to have some experience with it and understand how it works first. So for example, if you're in a 4-man cleave or 8-man cleave, or you're just in a cleave of a lot of players, and you basically guaranteed that you're going to get a decent amount of heal from your blood rage that you're about to pop, or you're about to get this reset a lot because you're cleaving, and or somebody's about to die, then it is a viable defensive to actually pop. But if that's not the case, don't use it early, as it can sometimes backfire. As I talked about before, then enriched defense. And outside of that, you're pretty much just saving saber ward again for the last. One thing to think about too with saber ward is when you are stunned, the defense chance does not work. However, the 25% yellow damage absorb still does work, so do keep that in mind depending on the matchup that you're dealing with. And when it comes to dealing with a lot of the other classes in the game, Force Push is a very useful ability. Most of the time, you can secure kills during Force Push desync, which is very helpful for you dealing with Sorks. You can kill them before, like if you're ever to like kind of like secure a Force Push, you're able to basically deny them the ability to force barrier. Dealing with Marauders, for example, a lot of people don't seem to remember this or even think about this. Even if they pop their Saber Ward, they're not immune to knocks during that window. They have to have CC immunity from their other abilities. So for example, Force Squash immunity or Precision Window immunity. They can still be knocked. So there is some things to think about outside of the obvious hydraulic overrides. You want to be able to get your Force Push off. You want to be able to get that leap back. You don't want to waste that ability. So that's one thing that you always want to focus on, especially as any of the other specs. Getting your Force Push usage down is very helpful, especially as Vengeance. If you can push somebody into cleave, you're getting so much value out of that as well. Other than that, that's pretty much most of your defenses. There's not much to think about outside of that, and typically speaking, it is a little bit more simple most of the time. And I would just recommend getting in the habit of using all your defenses before dying and not leaving them up. The whole general ideal of defensive rotation is to use your lowest cooldown abilities first and then use your longest cooldown last. There's an option to run through Passion is very good. However, most of the time, you're not going to see a second enraged defense anyway, so the value is sometimes not there. Other than that, that is pretty much defensive explained. To prevent myself from talking about it for too much or rambling on too long, feel free to leave any questions in the comments or anything that I didn't clarify as well. As you would hope, feel free to leave a comment. I'll be happy to give you more information or fill anything that I forgot. All right, now to go into your priority defenses. Offenses, my bad. So the whole ideal here is that you have two AoE abilities that will basically apply dots to everybody. You have your slam, which will be your spread. So this will be your dot spread. So it's centered around you. You want to be mindful of like where you're standing to try to get the maximum use of your spread and the maximum use of the damage that is available from this ability. It's very strong and it is pretty good overall. It'll be where most of your damage comes from, especially if you're able to get a lot of blood rage resets. And there's just a lot of cleave in general. The other one will be Force Scream. This will be an AoE, so this will play an AoE dot to everybody. So this is something that you can kind of like pull away from using immediately and then trying to slam spread it because it's already going to be AoE applied. And then you have, outside of those abilities, you have your main priority dot, which will be Shatter, and then your second main priority dot will be Impel. When it comes to single target damage, you're looking at Impel and Hue as your main single target damage, and then Ravage as your third. However, there are situational uses. So for example, Slam will be #1 priority if you have your dots up. If you don't have your dots up, Slam becomes lower priority than all of your dots. Your dots will be higher priority. Hue will always be a good filler, single target burst damage. And so will Impel, but typically do keep in mind the interaction between your Slam and then your dots. Shatter will also reset your Ravage, so that is another thing to also keep in mind, especially if you're running a Hemophilic Slash, which I'm currently running right now. We'll go ahead and put that back on. And then your Rage Builder will be a Saber Throw and Centering Assault, and obviously a Leap, Force Potion Leap. Overall, it's pretty simplistic. Retaliation is also an ability that will allow you to hit through defensive. So for example, if somebody diversion to you, you can still use Retaliation, will still hit. Or they pop Evasion, or they pop Saber Ward, and you can still use Retaliation to hit them through that. However, it's not like a high priority ability. Anytime that you can cleave, you would rather do that. Even slamming on single target is still most of the time better. Now, when it comes to kind of like how things will work, you're kind of looking at the old-fashioned rotation when it comes to using Hemophilic Slash. So you would prioritize your Ravage. So basically what's going to happen here is I'm going to Sunder, I'm going to get my Force Scream going, I'm going to get my Impel going, and then I'm going to Ravage to immediately refresh that, then I'm going to Shatter, and then I'm going to refresh that again, run it all 3 of our dots up, go ahead and Force Scream, Impel again, to you. Kind of like get the ideal here. The whole ideal is to avoid your dots from dropping. In the situation, your dots going to drop pretty much no matter what at certain points, but with some modifications to your rotation, you can kind of maintain the uptime on Hemophilic Slash a lot better than what I'm just showing here. But the whole concept there is to showcase how it works. When you Ravage, it'll refresh your dot duration, so therefore you're not losing your value of your tactical. So for example, if you delay there on your second Ravage or the refresh, you can kind of get your timings a little bit better. Other than that, that is Hemophilic Slash. Not a lot to think about there. Don't really recommend it, but Slam Spam is also not a lot to think about either, so it's kind of like just a background thought. When it comes to cleave, you're going to be getting a lot of slam resets. You're going to get a lot of blood rage resets. So the cooldowns for those abilities are going to tick down extremely fast. So for example, having cooldown text is really going to help you in that situation. So the whole ideal here when it comes to dot spread, you're looking at getting your Shatter off as your best dot, and then you can get a Slam to spread those, and then Force Scream, since it's already an AoE, perfectly set, Slam again. So the whole ideal there is to get your priority dots off first. So it'll be those two. And then this one will already be AoE, but you would immediately go into Slam for your Force Scream most of the time, as you want to get your dots going as soon as possible. So for example, if there's just a massive AoE, you're probably going to use your Scream first as a better priority, and to Shatter and to Impel, and then do it that way, as that is the order of priority for the most AoE damage that you could possibly do. Scream, you want to get that on cooldown as soon as possible because it is such a high damage ability in cleave situations. And then Shatter, because it's going to be your highest hitting dot, and you want to get that going off as soon as you can because you can basically perma maintain that one. And then Impel, since it'll be good single target damage, but the dot variant tied to Impel is not very good. However, it will still increase the critical hit chance when you run the talent here that I'm running. Other than that, it's not like amazing. I highly recommend running this talent if you're not running the root control build. Definitely recommend that one. Other than that, that is kind of like the core for that. And then when it comes to like getting maximum damage out of your Ravage, obviously you do more damage per dot that you have on the target for your Ravage, but your Ravage doesn't do that much in the first place. So It's an old mechanic that you would pay attention to. Nowadays, it's not so much a mechanic that you pay attention to. And when it comes to Hammerflick Slash, that is something that you will pay attention to, but it's not super important. It's more so about timing to ensure that you don't get yourself in a situation where your dots are not as lined up in a way that you can't constantly refresh them. Other than that, that is pretty much for your offensive priorities. Definitely recommend having Blood Rage on a comfortable keybind. They'll be coming up all the time. And Slam, especially when you're new to Vengeance, I definitely recommend maybe even putting like something around the middle of your screen, wherever your eyes are all the time, even if it's like down here. Say you're looking at your bars still because you're still new. I highly recommend putting it somewhere where you can always see those cooldowns, even if it is out of like the corner of your eye while you're playing. Highly recommend it, as it will definitely increase your damage tenfold. Slam is very powerful, and not all the time will you have all of your dots up, but being able to get the use of your slam is just, it's too good. Cut to Pieces is that strong. And cleaving on the spec usually ends up in a team wipe because it's that powerful. Other than that, I can't really think of anything that I missed. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be happy to cover them. And then if I've missed anything, just let me know. Now, to give you a quick rundown of what to expect as Vengeance, you are going to be the front line just like any other Jug spec. On top of that, you're going to have access to a lot of healing and a lot of cleave. However, anytime that you have to deal with ranged players, they're not going to be too fun to deal with. It's not in your favor. You're not going to have a lot of tools to deal with them. If you don't have other melee players, you're going to be generally miserable. Vengeance is definitely a hit or miss spec these days because the durability is not there, and on top of that, it has no escape, and it is kind of centered around cleave nowadays. Its single target is not very good, and we're in a burst meta where single target reigns supreme. So that's something to definitely think about before picking up Vengeance and wanting to like really enjoy it, as most of the time you'll get into games where Vengeance doesn't shine and isn't as useful as other specs. When it comes to what I play and what you see me post quite often, you don't see Vengeance very often, and you'll usually see Hatred far more often than I am playing Vengeance, and that's because I think Hatred is just arguably better, and there are sometimes that Vengeance is pretty good, but overall I don't typically play a lot of games with other people, and when I do group, there's not really anything going on when I'm grouping, so I just don't feel like playing Vengeance, if that makes sense. If I played in a group like all the time, I would probably be playing this a lot more, but I solo queue quite a bit, and most of the time that I group up, it's specifically to play against other groups. I don't enjoy just rolling the queue, unlike some other people, so there are a lot less chances for me to get to really play and enjoy this class. Raid Juggernaut is a different story because, you know, Raid Juggernaut is meta. Regardless, definitely take Vengeance with a grain of salt. It can do a lot of damage, but it requires enemy players to be relatively silly, probably keyboard disabled, and healer to heal through all your cleave. Other than that, let's go into talents. First thing I'm about to talk about is that you do have an option to run quite a bit of root. So you have Ravage Root, and then you also have Skirting Strike, and with Shatter you can reset your Ravage. So that means you can get quite a bit of a root chain on somebody. So this does allow for a lot of control. Now going into our talents, I don't really recommend anything else other than Deep Cuts because this increases your critical hit chance of your bleeds. So this means that any of your dots that you put on somebody, you have a 10% just increased crit chance, so that means it'll crit more often, so that means you get cut to pieces more often. This also means more damage in general. And then the initial damage of Shatter. Shatter doesn't really do that much more damage, so 50% of nothing is not very much. And then this one is more so for heroic kind of stuff where there's a lot of ads. Overall, Shadow Burst is just not very good. You'll never take Path Carver, as Path Carver doesn't really have much value. On the top of that, Slipping Slash doesn't have much value in general. However, if we didn't have Cut to Pieces, Slipping Slash can be very good. You also get another passive along in your tree that also increases the damage of Slipping Slash. So it's not just Path Carver. When you have dots on your target, you'll do increased damage with Slipping Slash as well. And then you have Ravage Root. Typically, I like the AoE Scream because it's an AoE slow as well, which just further benefits your playstyle, gives you more cooldown reduction on your cut to pieces, and the slow is just invaluable. Now going into your next row here, 10% additional damage and generating extra rage doesn't really help you that much, and most of the time you won't find the value in this like almost ever, because rage is not usually an issue. Even I think on the Swtor build, it's not really an issue, so I don't really understand why this one exists, and the 10% additional damage is almost nothing. Now this one, we don't care about the extra additional critical bleed. However, it does definitely help us in the long run for extra damage. But mainly looking at the Impel's critical hit chance, it's increased by 20%. This means that one of your hardest hitting single target abilities will now crit more often. So that means it'll be a more consistent ability overall, especially with you. Those two being your large, not your large, but your high hitting abilities. Not large, my bad. Then you also have Skewering Strike. This gives you a root. This basically just replaces your impel, and it also moves you to the target. It's an interesting ability. There's definitely a lot of use cases for it. However, I just don't like it, so I don't usually use it. However, when it comes into most war zones, and especially most arenas, this is going to find more value than the other one. However, if you're pretty experienced, I highly recommend using Bleeding Offense over, but there are a lot of use cases. So 9 times out of 10, you will find Skewering Strike to be a little bit more useful. However, the flat damage increase to Bleeding Offense, if you're already experienced and you're pretty good at movement, you'll see a lot more value damage-wise. Now going into this row here, Fierce Power, as I said before, complete new bait talent. Don't recommend it anymore. It's not very good. And it will lock you into Ghost GCDs at times. That was like one of the big issues of last expansion. Then you have Bloodbound. This one gives you percent health heal per dot on target up to 20%. This is probably the best part of Vengeance and the change to Vengeance for 6.0. So this means your Enter Pain can become more of a defensive, because you'll actually get the extra 30% health, and then you can get an extra 20% heal. Not extra 20% heal, but you get the 20% heal, which will give you extra health out of that 30%. And then you have Blood Rates, which is really good. This basically means that you can just slam spam non-stop when you pop this. However, you don't get the cooldown reduction, you don't get the healing effect, and you don't get the root break. So it is very niche overall. And then for the rest of the talents, they're pretty much static. You have Warmonger, you pretty much don't change this. You have War Master, you pretty much don't change that. You have Mad Dash or Reflect, that's your main option there. And then Pooled Hatred versus Through Passion. We don't really mess with this one. The Sunder is cool, but overall, it's not necessary. Damage is already really high. So you're mainly looking at Mad Dash versus Reflect. There are going to be certain situations where Reflect is going to be better. And if you're inexperienced with movement, Saber Reflect is just going to be better. And then Mad Dash is just a mobility. And also, do keep in mind, it's only for 0.5 seconds that you have this defense chance. So you're not going to get consistent dodges with it. However, when you're more experienced, you'll be able to make better use of it. Overall, your talents are pretty static. I don't really use to change these. It's rare that I'll run Skewering Strike or Overwhelming Slashes. Most of the time I'll swap Skewering Strike, and that's about it. Overall, talent loadout, not as bad as some other classes, but for the most part, I do think this class should have slightly more damage reduction and or a better single target build than what it currently has. I do not like the cut to pieces build. And that's part of the reason why you don't really see me play it as much as I used to. I know I used to play this all the time in 5.0, but it's definitely fallen from grace for me. Kind of like how Annihilation did back in 3.0. Really liked 2.0 Annihilation, and then 3.0 came out, and I'm just like, this is not the same class that I fell in love with. Regardless, I've always loved Rage, and I'm super happy Rage is at least viable, so I can still get my Juggernaut fix in. Other than that, that's pretty much it for talents. Now, to reemphasize on pretty much everything that I've gone over in this video, when it comes to playing the game as Juggernaut, just in general, it's very important to have nearest ally bound so you can actually, I don't have IQ up, so I am hitting the caps lock. But assuming that you have probably a program, whether you have a Razer keyboard, a Corsair keyboard, or just any other kind of keyboard that might have a program that allows you to rebind your keys to something else, there's probably even generic things that will allow you to do so. But the whole ideal here is that I have my caps lock bound to a different key on my keyboard because I don't use caps lock almost ever. So this means I can use a second keybind right next to my tab, which I already use for targeting players. I can target nearest ally. This means that I can then intercede to them. And if I was guarding, I could also guard them as well. Something that you always want to keep in mind. It'll help your mobility, help your ability to reposition. It'll help you to get your leap again, so you get your CC immunity and your damage reduction. And overall, it's just good. You don't get the same, or not CC, but you don't get the same root break that Rage has. But overall, it's not a bad thing. It's quite nice overall. Something I highly recommend doing, even if you put it on something else, so you can get out dodge pretty quick. So there's like definitely some situations where I overpush and hypergate consistently, knowing that I have intercede to save me. So assuming as long as nobody gets too close to me while I'm doing that, I'll be able to intercede away. Now going into defenses again, when it comes to choosing, like if you really want to go for damage, I still feel like Second Wind is going to be better than Fearless Victor, unless you're running the single target build. But even then, I feel like when you're focusing on a single target build, you're probably going to find more value out of Second Wind as well. So pretty much 9 times out of 10, I want to say Second Wind's going to be best in slot with Champion Precision. You're usually not going to change that much. It's not very valuable for you. Very rarely are you ever going to find value in Life Order, and this is a Arena Pacific thing. Critique is very good, but specifically for Arena, there's no point in running this in PvP, or I guess War Zones. If you're running Nimble Master and you're focused on objectives, but you still want to have that cleave power, Nimble Master plus Critique is really not that bad. However, Second Wind is also very good too, so it's totally up to you. Nimble Master and Second Wind sounds kind of mean, but it probably wouldn't be that bad if you're not as focused on doing damage. Because for the most part, when it comes to doing damage, cut the pieces, it doesn't really matter what your gear stats are. It doesn't really matter anything about you whatsoever. You could have really scuffed stats. You could have like no implants. It doesn't really matter. Most of your damage is just coming from slam and getting the reset for slam. So if there's ever a chance where you can get a lot of cleave, regardless of your gear, even if you're running like mitigation sets for some godforsaken reason, highly do not recommend doing that. But you could still do a crap ton of damage with slam. It is literally a 1-button spec, or it has 2 buttons because you'd be using Bloodletting or Blood Rage off cooldown with slam. One thing to keep in mind too is when you get your AoEs going, you will be spreading the dots that fall off of somebody. If they're still on somebody else, you'll spread it back to them, vice versa. So you'll ping pong a lot of your dots in most situations when you're in a cleave like that. So you don't always need to reapply your dots, but overall for Scream is always going to be a net positive in damage over your slam. So if you're ever getting a cleave game of your life, Scream is something that you always want to use on cooldown if you have the AoE variant. Other than that, it's Shatter. That would be the #1 priority if you're going to use another dot. Overall, just continue to slam. Typically any window where you can't slam, reapply your dot. Now with that out of the way, it's very simple to play, not much to think about rotationally. And when it comes to overextending, it is definitely an issue, but having your intercede is really going to save your life. If you guys have any questions about Vengeance, or you just want to know more or see more gameplay on Vengeance and or commentaries, I do have a section on my YouTube that specifically is catered to per spec. So all my videos per spec will be in that playlist. Feel free to check that out. Other than that, I appreciate you guys for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.